David rose and went, along with his men, and killed 100 of the Philistines. And David brought their foreskins, which were given in full number to the king, that he might become the king's son-in-law. Saul gave him his daughter Michal as a wife. But when Saul realized that the Lord was with David, and that Saul's daughter Michal loved him, Saul was still more afraid of David. So Saul was David's enemy from that time forward. You all know now that I love retelling Bible stories in ways that help people to hear them in new ways, always finding some new angle or point of view. But I have always insisted that my way of telling these stories is not the only way. In fact, I have always hoped that my approach would encourage, maybe even inspire, others to find their own unique takes on these wonderful narratives. Well, something recently happened that made me see that dream coming true. Matt Meyer, one of my faithful listeners, supporters, and a friend I have come to make through all of this wonderful experience, sent me his own set of stories. They were great, and were all based around the character of Michal, daughter of Saul and wife of David. Now, I have done my own story of Michal. I called it the 100 Foreskin Princess, but I was quite impressed with how Matt had expanded beyond what I had done to use her character to explore other stories that I had also dealt with. It was kind of genius. So I asked Matt if we could do something special. He could be my first guest storyteller. I persuaded him to record his stories, and I would stitch them together in the style of this podcast, and then we could have a little time to discuss our unique takes together. So that is what we have done. Here is part 1 of Matt's cycle of stories, stories from before Michal's fateful marriage. And stick around afterwards for what I'm sure will be a fun discussion. This is Retelling the Bible. Extra episode, Michal, a Cautionary Tale, part 1.
Michal was just a little girl when the Ark of the God of Israel was captured by the Philistines. It was a favorite story of hers to hear from her grandfather Kish. Michal loved stories. She had always been curious and inquisitive. As a girl, Michal would stand at the flaps of the tents, waiting for the men to return from the fields, and begging them to tell her of any news or of any new stories they had heard. It was charming how Michal's eyes would sparkle with excitement whenever she would ask for a story. And so, in the evenings, when everyone would gather to hear tales, Michal would always ask to hear the story of when the Ark of the God of Israel went down to Philistia, her face beaming. Who could refuse? The men who had been in battle told the tale one way. We brought the Ark of God onto the battlefield to fight for us, and boy did God fight for us. You see, we let the Philistines capture the Ark. We knew that God would wreak havoc in their temples and in their cities, It was an inside job. That's not how Kish told the tale. Kish was a humble man. He had plenty enough wealth and had no need of more. He was satisfied with the portion that had been allotted to his family by Joshua. The boundary lines had indeed fallen for him in pleasant places. He had no military ambition to expand his territory like the other Benjaminites, who were often going to war against the Philistines. These men believed they could do no wrong because God was on their side. Literally, the Israelites had built their God a portable throne, and this throne was known as the Ark of the God of Israel. Kish knew better. He knew that the God of Israel could not be contained or coerced, could not be controlled. Kish knew that the God of Israel acted in ways incomprehensible to mere mortals. Thus, as Kish told the tale, he would describe how the Israelite army had suffered a humiliating defeat at the hands of the Philistines. The elders, believing they could wield God like one of their swords, sent soldiers to retrieve the ark of God from Shiloh. Eli the priest refused to give them his blessing, but neither could he deter them. His sons Hophni and Phinehas were all too happy to ingratiate themselves with the army. They were known to take extra portions for themselves from the sacrifices of the people. They were known to have raped the women who served at the tent of meeting. Hophni and Phinehas figured there would be plenty of both among the spoils of battle. The priest's sons brought the ark of the God of Israel into the camp. Its arrival caused an uproar. The Philistines almost fled in terror at the surge in their enemies' morale, but the Philistines held their ground. God, however, would not be contained. God would not stoop or bow to the army's ambitions. God vacated the throne above the ark and abandoned Israel to fight for themselves. As the dust of the battle cleared, the Philistines had won again. The priest's sons were slaughtered, and the ark of the God of Israel was captured. The Philistines believed that because they had defeated Israel in battle, their God had defeated the God of Israel. They believed that they could contain the God of Israel and housed the ark within the temple to their own God. But the God of Israel would not be contained. Morning after morning, the God of the Philistines was found bowing before the God of Israel. Morning by morning, until the idol began to crumble, and even its head and its hands fell off. Even the people were afflicted with cancerous tumors. The Philistines moved the ark from city to city, hoping for relief, but affliction followed wherever the ark went. The Philistines could stand it no longer and returned the ark. The rulers of the Philistines set the ark upon a cart with gifts of gold and let the cattle find their own way back to Israel. Eventually, the ark was brought to Kiriath Jearim, to the house of Abinadab. There it remained all the days that Kish lived to tell this tale to his curious and inquisitive granddaughter. Michal stood at the mouth of her tent, as she had done so many times before, watching for news. Her father Saul had gone off to look for some wayward donkeys that belonged to his father, Kish. Saul had set off with one of the servants to look for the animals. Michal mapped out in her mind the route that they would take throughout the land of Benjamin and the hill country of Ephraim. Shalisha, Shalim, Zuph. Michal, of course, had visited none of these places, but she heard tell of them in the tales that were brought home to her. Her father had been gone far too long. The donkeys had returned, but Saul was not with them. It seemed, like the cattle that had returned the ark of the God of Israel, that they knew exactly where to go all along. Kish had begun to worry. He sent more servants to look for Saul to tell him that the donkeys had been found, and this caused Michal to worry also. Had her father fallen in with brigands? Was he struck down by the Philistines? Did he encounter a wild animal? Michal's imagination ran wild. Finally, one day, as Michal was watching from the mouth of the tents, her father appeared over the horizon, the servant with him. Michal rushed to Saul as he approached their dwelling place. She fell upon Saul's neck and wept and kissed her father. her fright and anxiety giving way to relief. "Abba, father, you've been gone so long. Surely you have new stories to tell," Michal said. She turned her charming smile toward her father, expecting him to smile in return, but Saul only looked troubled. "In due time," Saul said gravely. Michal was crestfallen. She attended to her father's needs in silence. That evening Saul told them a tale beyond anything Michal could have imagined. He told his family of how he had traveled with the servant throughout Benjamin and the hill country of Ephraim. They could not find the donkeys anywhere. Saul wanted to return home. He knew that Kish would worry, but the servant persuaded him to press on. They would go to visit the seer Samuel. They arrived in Bethel. Samuel, it seemed, had been watching at the door of the shrine for them. The man of God rushed out to meet them. He invited them to eat with him. Samuel had even set aside a portion of the sacrifice for them. The next morning Samuel pulled Saul aside and told him strange things. Samuel told Saul that he would be king over Israel and anointed him with oil. Samuel told Saul of the strange meetings that would happen to him on the way home, and that these events would be signs to him that what Samuel had told him would come true. First, Saul met some of his father's servants in Zelzah, near Rachel's tomb. They told him that the donkeys had been found, and that Kish was now looking for Saul. Next, he came across 3 men on their way to Bethel at the Oak of Tabor. They gave Saul 2 loaves of bread to replenish his depleted provisions. Finally, Saul came to Gibeah and met a company of prophets. The Spirit of God came upon him, and Saul joined them in their ecstatics. "Is Saul also among the prophets?" Kish roared with laughter. "King of Israel! I know Michal loves to hear new stories, but this is quite the fairy tale you've made up. You need not be embarrassed about not finding the donkey, son. I'm just glad you've made it home safely." Saul averted his eyes from his father, but Michal could see the pained expression on his face, as though he was being tormented by an evil spirit. She was not so sure that her father had made this story up. "Why don't you leave the storytelling to Kish?" Michal's grandfather said. "I wouldn't repeat that tale again, not even to your uncle." As Michal grew older, she continued to watch for new stories, but she no longer watched from the flaps of the tent. These days Michal watched from the palace window. Her father had not been lying when he told his family about what the seer had told him. It was the last story that Saul had ever told her. Saul no longer had the time, but Jonathan always made time for his little sister. Jonathan liked to tell Michal the tale of how their father was proclaimed king by the people of Israel. "I went up with father to Mizpah," Jonathan would tell her. "The seer Samuel had called the people together. He chastised them for asking for a king, and it almost seemed for a moment that he wouldn't do it. 'You have rejected God,' Samuel told them. But eventually he got down to business. Samuel held a lottery. It was a fix, though. We both know what father told us when he had gone looking for the donkeys. Samuel had already anointed father. Of course the lot fell to Benjamin, and then to the Matrites, and then to Kish, and finally to father. But do you know where father was?" "Tell me," Michal would cry. Of course she knew. She had heard the tale before, but she had to play the role that was expected of her in Jonathan's telling of the story. "Father was hiding among the baggage." Jonathan and Michal would always laugh at this part of the story. It was the part, however, that Michal loved best. Jonathan had told her another story, the tale of when the people had first asked Samuel for a king. Samuel had given the people a grave warning that day. The king would take away their sons to serve in his army or to plow his fields. The king would take away their daughters to be his bakers. Their fields would be taken, their produce would be taxed, their own servants would become the king's. Even they themselves would become slaves to the king. Jonathan had only ever told Michal this story once. She never asked for it a second time. She did not want to hear it again. And now Michal's own father had been made king. These words could not be true. Michal needed them to not be true. Yes, Saul had left behind their allotted portion. He had traded their tents for a palace. But he would never stoop so low as to do the things that Samuel had threatened. The man who hid among the baggage could not be the kind of tyrant king that Samuel described. Could he? In time, Michal grew tired of the war stories that Jonathan would bring home. Today we fought the Ammonites. Today we fought the Philistines. Today we fought the Amalekites. It certainly wasn't good for their enemies to encroach on the land of Israel, but such violence, day after day, was a little desensitizing. Michal was growing bored of these sorts of tales. But then one day, Jonathan brought home a story that was different than the other war stories. He and Saul had been gone for more than 40 days. The armies of Israel had been encamped in the valley of Elah against the Philistines. There we were, camped out on one mountain, with the Philistines across from us. We got ready to march down into the valley for battle, but the Philistines only sent one man. He was even taller than father. He must have been one of the Anakim. We could hear the Philistines chanting his name. Goliath! 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 Silence! Goliath yelled at the Philistines. Then he yelled at us. Why have you drawn up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? And are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants. We didn't know what to do, so we didn't do anything. We just held our position while the giant shouted. Next day, same thing. Day after day until David came. David's brothers were in the camp, and he had come to visit them. Some of his brothers are nearly as big as father, but David is just a runt. He's scrappy, though. David heard Goliath shout at us, and the Philistines chanting Goliath's name. He started asking about it. Well, you know how rash father is. He had promised that he would enrich whoever could defeat Goliath. No one would take him up on it except David. No one wanted to take David seriously. Goliath was so huge, and David was so small. There was no way that David could win. But he puffed up his chest and said, I may just be a humble shepherd, but whenever a lion or a bear would go out after one of the lambs, I would rescue it. I have killed lions and bears. Surely the God of Israel will deliver this uncircumcised dog of a Philistine into my hand. Everyone laughed except father. He looked grave, like he was wrestling with his spirit. God be with you, he said. Father tried to give David his armor and his sword, but David refused them. He took only his sling. Everyone laughed again, but we Benjaminites know how deadly a sling can be in the right hands. Left hands, you mean? Michal interjected. Jonathan laughed. You know what I mean. Anyhow, David went down the mountain and met Goliath in the valley. We could hear the whole Philistine army laughing. Silence! Goliath yelled at the Philistines. He taunted David. David puffed up his chest again and said something to Goliath. Goliath lumbered toward him, and David slung a stone. It hit Goliath square in the forehead and took him down. David rushed forward and cut off that Philistine's head with his own sword. Michal fell in love with David through Jonathan's stories. The two had become fast friends, and so Jonathan was always coming home with stories of their exploits. Saul has killed his thousands, Jonathan would say at the end of each story, and David his 10,000s, Michal would answer.
Well, friends, you just heard 4 incredible stories about Michal, the daughter of Saul, and I'm very happy to introduce to you Matt Meyer, who created those stories and recorded them for me. And Matt, could you just maybe introduce yourself a little bit and tell us a little bit about you and what's going on in your world?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Matt Meyer. I'm a candidate under care for ordination in the Presbyterian Church USA. So I'm Scott's denominational downstairs neighbor. Um, but I should be in my last year of classes coming up. I'm a student at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. I've been doing that for quite some time now. The joke around campus is that it's the Moses path. But so I should be finishing up next year. In that time, I've also started doing my own website for liturgy writing, and I was actually inspired to do that, Scott, by one of your episodes, the parable of the next day in the vineyard, and the way you talked about your sense of calling and telling stories. And I had this sense of my developing call and writing liturgies, and thought, well, I need to find a way to try to share these. So it's churchoftheaffirmation.wordpress.com is where I've started putting those. And the goal with those is to be writing liturgy that still feels Presbyterian, but that also is forming people and being inclusive of all bodies, all loves, all brains.
Yes, and I can't say that I've used all of those liturgies, but I have the ones that I've been able to use and to review. You know, you've done some really fascinating, good work on expanding our approach to the liturgy and the prayer and just bringing people together in praise and worship. So thank you for your work.
Thank you.
And obviously, I'm going to put a link to that in the show notes for this episode so that people can explore that and find out a little bit more about your liturgies and think about how maybe they could use them as well.
And I should plug too, another way that we've crossed paths is also both co-hosting at times on The Word in Black and Red, which is another wonderful podcast.
Yes, and I've enjoyed. Well, every time I've been on there, and the times that we've been on there together, it's been wonderful exploring some of these Bible passages. But I specifically wanted to. You sent me a little while ago. You sent me these 8 stories of Michal, and we've just listened to. I love the stories. I asked you to record them, and I edited them together, and we've just listened to the first 4. And I just wanted to say, I wanted to thank you for sharing those stories for me. I've always believed that this project of mine of retelling Bible stories, I always wanted it to be an inclusive thing. You know, I want to take my own original take, my own original approach to these stories in the Bible. But I've always insisted that my way is not the only way. And so I really appreciate having somebody else come along and say, this is my take on these stories. And it's wonderful because I already did do like an episode on Michal. And my episode on Michal didn't touch on anything in these 4 stories we've just listened to. And I realized that in some ways, that's maybe my shortcoming. You know, I didn't even think of Michal and who this woman was before she got married. And isn't that an awful thing? I only thought of her in relationship to this man that she is so famous for marrying. But I appreciate these first 4 stories, and we'll we'll add the other 4 stories as another episode sometime in the future. But these first 4, before she emerges on the scene, before she's even a princess, right? And I appreciate your ability to imagine her before she becomes this character. So I really appreciated that about the stories you told. You made me think about these things that I never thought about before. So thank you for that. And I also appreciated in these first 4 stories, you gave us 4 narrators. I'm trying to think now. There was Kish, who would have been her grandfather,
Grandfather.
and then Saul, and then Jonathan, and then Jonathan again. Is that am I? There are 4 narrators. It's been a couple of days since I listened to it.
It's I mean, story within a story, so over the shoulder looking at Michal, but then
Yeah.
we hear stories from Kish, through her, through the narration, through Saul directly, and then two that are told by Jonathan.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and I mean, I started thinking about these. I mean, so the way you do your podcast and you have these stories that you tell, maybe just pulling one Bible verse, some off Bible verse, like Shira was one of the first episodes I listened to. Is around the time that I found out about the podcast, and just pulling these narratives out and thinking about these things is a big part of how I started thinking about this for this story, because my interest in the story originally is in the story with Uzzah, which I know you recently started finishing up that part of the narrative of the Ark of the Covenant. And even farther back to when my wife and I were just still dating and we were reading the Bible together. And we got to that story, and she said, that always bothered me. Why does he die? And I rattled something off that was probably complete and utter horseshit, that she didn't buy. But then my own thinking changed over time, and I had a chance to preach on that passage from the lectionary, and I left the Michal part out, or at least I didn't address it in the sermon, but I put the middle part back in because the lectionary takes out the part where he dies. And I thought, well, that would be dishonest. That would feel dishonest to me, to preach that. And the way I started thinking about it was, this is just, I don't know why, God's assigned for that, but this seems to really be because David wants to bring the ark into his city because he's consolidating his kingdom. And then as I was catching up on your podcast and I heard the 100 Philistine Foreskin Princess, I believe, episode 502.
Yes,
0.02.
whichever it was. Yes. Yeah.
I have it open in the other window. 5.2, 5.20. That got me thinking about Michal's role in that narrative, and just how she's very mistreated in the story. I mean, you said, that you didn't think about her much, and I mean, that's how she's written. She is introduced as having a crush on David. She helps him escape, and that's a really great story.
Absolutely.
Then she gets passed around a few times like a piece of property, and then she has this incident at the end where she's watching from the window, and David, she says something to David, rebukes him, and David curses her, and that's about all we get from her. But I was captured by that image of her looking out the window and being so bold as to bar David from his own house, to rebuke him while everyone else is celebrating. And that started getting me thinking about what would this whole narrative look like from Michal's perspective.
Yeah, and I really appreciate just the whole idea, because of course what you're doing, these are stories I've done in my own episode. The story of the ark, and the story of the loss of the ark, and the story of the ark among the Philistines. And I find it really fun to have all of this story seen through the eyes of this young woman, Michal. And it just gives me a whole new perspective. So I just really appreciated that. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, so like these stories that I did separately, dealing with as their own narratives, you have allowed me to see them through this particular character of Michal, and just I really appreciated it, and I thank you for this chance to maybe share it with some other people. So I hope people appreciate that. Yeah. So let me wind it up by saying thank you very much, Matt, for sharing a very different perspective on these stories and allowing me to share your stories with my listeners. I really appreciate that opportunity. And by all means, go and visit Matt's website, which you're going to remind me again. What's it called?
churchoftheaffirmation.wordpress.com.
churchoftheaffirmation.wordpress.com. And yes, I've been there a few times, and I would recommend it. And, you know, when I'm looking for a different slant, a different approach to a liturgy, I do like to go there. So I really appreciate the work you're doing there as well. And
Well, thank you.
all your best in finishing your studies. And I look forward to hearing about your career down the road, because obviously you got a lot of great things to share with the church and with the world.
Well, thank you, and thanks for sharing your platform with me.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. That is it for this special extra episode of Retelling the Bible. Please subscribe so you can get the next regular episode, another special Olympic episode, next week. And please rate and review wherever you download your podcasts. The theme music for the podcast is Da by Kevin MacLeod, and the mood music for this episode was Gymnopedie by Sasha End. The music is from the Creative Commons and is available on incompetech.com and on filmmusic.io, respectively. You can contact me on twitter.com @retellingbible and on the Facebook page Retelling the Bible. Show notes for this episode have been posted at retellingthebible.wordpress.com. This is Retelling the Bible, and your special guest storyteller today has been Matt Meyer.